Hello and welcome to Demystifying Poetry, the podcast that brings everyone closer to poets and poems. I'm your host, Tara Stubbs, and this episode I'm delighted to say that my guest is Will May. Welcome, Will.
Hi Tara, thank you very much for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Will May is a professor of modern and contemporary literature at the University of Southampton. He is the editor of the collected poems and drawings of Stevie Smith, published by Faber, and he has written on poets as various as Dorothy Parker and Ezra Pound. His forthcoming book, Poetry and Mentoring, explores the role that mentoring has played in UK poetry over the last 60 years. His 4-part podcast series called Verse Mentors is available on Spotify and anywhere you get your podcasts, and I've listened to it and I would highly recommend it. So Will, I invited you here today because I think the idea of making poetry more accessible and available, which is central to this podcast, is also central to a lot of the work that you do, from editing Stevie Smith's poetry to your work on poetry and mentoring. And also, like me, you're a working academic who teaches poetry in university context for undergraduates, for postgraduates, and at different levels. And so I wanted to start by asking you whether you think that poetry should be accessible to all.
Well, the short answer is going to be yes. But I do think it's actually the academic context, whether that's university or school, which have somehow gathered a sense that poetry is difficult. And in the various places I've either been talking about poetry or talking to poets or helping people write poetry or listening to it, once you step outside of a schoolroom or a university campus, you find that all these doors are open. And I think something about our experience that perhaps at school makes us feel like it might be difficult or not for us. So once you can kind of unpick some of that history, all this stuff can open up. And actually I think poetry is not only very accessible, but it's actually a way of starting conversations with people that you wouldn't speak to before or you might be scared of. So the whole idea of poetry being something terrifying, it's actually something that can really put everyone on an even playing field, actually, like bring different groups of people together.
That's interesting. I like that idea. Do you think that any of these issues are thanks to the growth in English studies of the last 100 years or so, the sort of defensiveness of English studies as something that's learnt academically and isn't a book club or a reading group?
That might have quite a lot to do with it. Universities have played, in a sense, a really central role in creating a lot of the infrastructure for poetry in the UK. Not just through like creative writing courses, but just the general sense that universities gather together lots of people interested in writing, and that might be the space for like extramural workshops, all kinds of things like that. But yeah, certainly the idea that there's a particular way of knowing about a poem might carry a lot of anxiety. I think also people are worried about getting things wrong. And particularly in school context, if you've been working in higher education the last 5 to 10 years or in school context, you realise there's an increased sense of people being really worried about anything where they might get something wrong or they might fail, and that's something people can have a real worry about. And because poetry is so open, there are so many different ways of thinking about it, and I think it's actually because of that that we might come with it with a sense of like, well, am I going to get the right answer? And it doesn't sort of give you everything wrapped up really nicely, and that's one of its joys. But I think, again, with that school context, that might be one of the worries, one of the concerns.
So why, you said it's to do with the last 5 years, you think it's got worse. Why is that? Because of the pandemic? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, partly. I suppose English is a subject which is mandatory at school, and it's really important for league tables. So it's hard for teachers to teach it with independence and kind of passion and sort of idiosyncrasy it might need, and also the kind of sense of needing to play a bit safe, mainly. So kind of like learning how to understand the poem and learning what the right answer is, which is it's not necessarily a very joyful way to think about poetry. So I think that might be a part of it, and I think that's probably something you see a little bit in the university classroom as well, in terms of people. I think again through COVID, having had less social interaction, and so there's a kind of sense of wanting to come to the room and not wanting to come speak unless they've got the right answer.
Yeah, so there's kind of nervousness.
Yeah,
around.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah.
And what about your different experiences of teaching in universities? Because, of course, you started in Oxford and you've taught in lots of places, actually, in your time, haven't you, before finishing that particular period in the Southampton. So is there a way that you think that students are different within these different communities? Or is it the same problems that come up in teaching poetry?
Well, I guess it's every classroom is a different experience, and sometimes you walk into a class and you feel like there's already lots of energy and excitement. It's all about directing in a particular way, and sometimes you walk into a classroom and you think the people here don't know each other and they don't quite feel comfortable with each other. And before we even think about what we're learning, we need to make sure that everyone's comfortable with each other. And I would say that sort of, lots of people I speak to in higher education have sort of noticed that's become more of a thing in kind of recent years.
And is that to do with the growth of what we might call cancel culture as well, do you think? And those kind of discussions around what subjects are off bounds or what subjects people feel that they haven't got the authority to talk about?
Yeah, well, I think I would even put it just more to do with the idea of saying something you're not quite sure of, and also the sense you might get somewhere together with somebody else. You might kind of create an answer you don't yet know. Okay, so the sense that you come to a room with things you're all about to find out, and none of you have quite thought them yet, and that's what is joyful about talking about poetry. But
also intimidating.
But also can be quite intimidating
because you can't really prepare.
Yeah, or rather, you can think about things that you might kind of been interested in, kind of baffled by, etc. But yeah, again, it's like not wanting to get something wrong, I suppose.
So I think there's a kind of vein running through a lot of what you do, which is about making poetry more attainable and more fun. I think your work on Stevie Smith shows that she's to be taken seriously, but also that she's got this kind of fun element to her. And I know you did quite a lot of work around Stevie Smith and the public as well when you were doing that work. But also now you're doing the work on poetry and mentoring. So could you maybe say a bit about how you've made that transition to a more public space and how that works in your wider academic work?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose when I was probably a teenager, or kind of 12 or 13, I saw this play called Stevie in like a basement theatre, and it's a biographical play by Hugh Whitemore about Stevie Smith, and it makes her seem like the most kind of desperately kind of garret poet, solitary kind of figure. As a 13-year-old, that seemed amazing. Like she was kind of intense, and as you say, she's actually really playful and humorous and uncomfortable, but in exciting ways. But as a 13-year-old, what totally hit me was like, there's her and there's no one else. She's all alone. And that is such a pervasive myth of what we might think a poet is. So yeah, lots of the work I did early on in my career was about poets who seemed like total outsiders. So either they seemed like eccentric, or, they said things in interviews like, I would cross the street rather than hear a poem. That kind of sense of like, there's my poetry, but there is no one else's.
Like Marianne Moore as well. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think like she interviewed Steve Smith about what poetry she read, and she was like, well, no one's got my own. Very much. And when I got to Southampton, I got very excited about the fact that the department had been set up by this poet called F.G. Prince, who
another one,
quite unfamiliar to me. But again, he seemed really kind of solitary, and he was always kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time, really. So he was in Oxford in the 1930s when Spender and Day Lewis and Auden were all there, and then his diary, which we found in the archive at Southampton, was quite a lot of him hiding, really, of just going, oh God, I went to a party with Stephen Spender, it was terrifying, and I came home. And then he was a poet, but a poet who was so almost secret about his poetry that all the people he taught at university, he was a Milton scholar, had no idea he was a poet. And then the letters that people wrote to him were incredible. There were letters from like John Ashbery and Susan Howe, all these incredible writers. And they loved him, and he was kind of like a mentor to them. And I suppose like something about my work on that made me realise that these people I think was really solitary and by themselves and idiosyncratic, like F.G. Prince and Stevie Smith, actually they're really well connected, but in quite invisible sorts of ways. And it made me sort of rethink my idea of what a writer was, that it wasn't kind of this lone kind of genius person on a plinth, and actually they were connected in all kinds of ways to people. And I suppose there are reasons why a publisher or a journalist might want to tell a story of a poet having arrived from nowhere, but nobody comes from nowhere. They come from a whole community of people who are kind of supporting them.
That reminds me a lot about Marion Moore as well, because she was someone who, she has the most boring diaries in the world. They say things like, had a bowel movement, took my book back to the library. And when they found them, everyone was so excited and they're so dull, you know. Gave
Is
my
it a
mum
cover?
her
Was she really a
medicine.
spy?
Well, but then she would also say, you know, I had T.S. Eliot sitting on my bath eating tin tuna, you know. Because she knew everyone, but she just wasn't that bothered that she knew everyone, and she treated them all like they were quite boring, as far as I could tell.
Yeah, and it has that kind of...
Yeah.
I suppose, sorry, coming, I really sort of steered away from the central thing of your question, actually, about the public space, because I think the transition you talk about was actually all around making poetry kind of public and performable. And Stevie Smith is actually a poet who people have loved to perform. So a lot of actors in the time, Glenda Jackson, recorded her work on LP, and this was a time where, you know, poetry was so in vogue in the 60s. You know, there were record labels which just did LPs of people reading poetry, and so we did sort of community theatre productions of people reading Smith's poetry. And what was really exciting for me is like working with young people and getting them to read poetry was great. But also seeing the audiences and how these poems, which actually people would be quite scared of on the page or not be sure of, audiences always knew how to respond. Like, they would laugh, sometimes in different places each night, but that kind of sense that the audience helps make the poem as well, and it kind of performed. So I suppose a lot of that work with people in theatre kind of helped me see that poetry could be a public thing.
Yeah, I remember going to an event that you did that was around, I think, the play, Stevie, and I remember, and you mentioned it to me afterwards as well, about how people talk about her as if she's their best mate.
Yeah.
Oh, Stevie thinks this, or Stevie did that.
Yeah.
As if they had this kind of personal connection.
Yeah, almost like she's kind of flirting with them.
Yeah.
She's like conspiratorially.
Oh, Stevie wouldn't have done that. You know, there was a lot of that, wasn't there? Which is so interesting when someone was so unfriendly in lots of ways. And I remember you also were very interested in the illustrations as well of her poems. And do you feel that giving some sort of sense of what they mean is also helpful for thinking about making poetry more accessible? Because sometimes they kind of work with the poem and other times they don't.
I suppose like having a poet who illustrates their poems, or rather has drawings of their poems, does lead you back to places where, you know, lots of people might have been as a kid maybe with poems, listening to like Edward Lear or like T.S. Eliot or
even Cat in the Hat.
Cat in the Hat, absolutely. So a kind of sense of play, and also that kind of sense of, I mean, she called her drawings doodles, and so if you're using a language of doodles about your drawings, then the poems too could be, you know, she often said, I just, you know, think about them when I'm cleaning the house, or, you know, the sense that they're not something she came back to and worked on.
There's loads of craft.
But they were just, they were just kind of thrown out there. And like that was a bit of a performance, I'm talking about that. But again, it makes poetry really accessible. And I've always thought that one of the gifts she has given to literary culture, I think, is the idea that anyone can be a poet. You know, she always said, you know, the poet's not an important person, there'll always be another poet. They don't need to be this kind of hallowed figure.
No.
But also, a poem can be about anything, you know. And I think, although a lot of people were surprised and kind of confused by her at the time, you know, one of the things Philip Larkin marvelled at with her is that, you know, she can write a poem about anything, and she'll start the poem going, how, you know, you'll be reading it thinking, how on earth can I write a poem about this? Like you know, a sparrow outside, just not doing anything. And just something magic emerges from it, right? So that's also quite democratising, the idea that anyone could be a poet and a poem could write anything. Suddenly the whole world's open, isn't it?
And that would have been very different from a lot of the people of her period.
Yeah, exactly.
Saying, actually, you have to be this artist, and you have to have your own space, and you have to have enough money.
Exactly.
You have to be well read. It's like very different, isn't it? So then you started working on this poetry and mentoring project, and as I mentioned, you've also got your podcast series, Verse Mentors. Could you explain to people what that means, poetry and mentoring, for people who've not come across that idea before?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, normally a mentor is someone of more experience or authority in any context, really. It's normally a one-to-one context where they're helping someone else for an amount of time, kind of to get further to where they need to go. And the word it's kind of interesting, actually, to think about where it comes from. So it's from the Odyssey. And, and mentors the character who's like standing in for Odysseus to kind of watch over Telemachus, his son, while he's away. So it's kind of almost like a substitute parent kind of figure. Although, I mean, we don't want to get too much into just talking about Odysseus. But what's quite funny in that thinking about it, is actually Athena, the goddess, essentially does all the work and Mentor doesn't do anything. And without getting into stuff, well, there is quite some interesting stuff thinking about the history of it that came up in the book, actually, that lots of people salute particular male mentors, and some of the poets I interviewed and came across for the project, like Mimi Calvati springs to mind, who kind of has done such incredible work over decades, really, to build the infrastructure of UK poetry, like founding the poetry school, Pascal Petit, and doing all these things. And almost everyone I spoke to about their mentoring experience said, I've had this incredible mentoring journey with Mimi Calvati, and when the mentoring came to an end, she was there with me still and was always, and I kind of thought, how does this person have so much time? It's amazing. But, so if you dig around, these names come up, but the names that literary scholars might talk about are different names, and they tend to be men.
Men, yeah.
Yeah.
That came through really strongly in your podcast, and I was really interested because I'd forgotten from when I'd read The Odyssey about that character Mentor, because they weren't the best mentor, and they didn't seem to be very wise at points. But then neither is Odysseus, to be honest.
Yeah.
So it is a good job for Athena, really. In that story.
That's true. And I suppose there's kind of just different moments in, because I suppose one of the things that came about with the book, or why I started the project, was it seems like now if you look at contemporary poetry, mentoring is everywhere and it's really visible. So there's a book just here on the table between us by Romalyn Anti, who was actually one of the mentors for a scheme we set up. And this is her first collection. It's called Antiemetic for Homesickness. Kind of really wonderful account of lots of things like working as a nurse in the NHS, kind of ideas of care and family, thinking about Filipino heritage. It's really incredible work. But what's interesting about it as well is if you read the acknowledgements page, it doesn't just say this poem was published in Rialto, or this poem was published in Poetry Review. It kind of says, here are all the mentors, here's the Joe Wood Arvon scheme I did, here's the massive community of people that helped me. And a book published like 20 years ago would have none of that acknowledgement. So the kind of sense that a book by a poet now is almost a kind of a lived history of all the people who are there. I think like Roddy Lumsden actually used to say, he's a kind of a poet and mentor who figures quite a lot in the book, that really the acknowledgements page of a poetry book is like the best poem often. It's like the thing that something tells us happening.
But it tells you a lot about the author.
It tells you quite a lot about the author,
and their kind of humility or otherwise.
Yeah, in the sense of like gift giving, and the sense particularly it happens in poetry, almost this economy of gift giving, because it's not a world where people do not make millions of pounds from being a poet, and almost because of that, there's a kind of sense that it operates in a slightly different way. There are these economies of kind of giving gifts and time in ways that are slightly different to other bits, maybe of literature.
And mentioning this poet, and she was talking on your podcast, wasn't she, about having criticisms for writing what she knows as well, which I found fascinating. Yeah. I thought you were supposed to write what you know. Yeah. That was just really strange for me, that moment.
But I suppose that really conjures up something else that is a big story of mentoring, really. So although, obviously poets have been learning from other poets since forever, what is very new, I think, in the last 2 decades is how visible it's become. And I think that's also really helped by and to do with kind of some really good interventions that happened to make poetry, a bit less elitist, a bit less white, a bit less dominated, as it has been massively in the earlier part of the decades in like the 20th century by white middle class educated men. Yeah, exactly. The way in which kind of writing what you know is a really good example. If what you know is exactly the same as what all the other published poets know, of course you can write what you know. But if you have an experience which is very different to all the published poets you see around you, like, you might get some pushback about writing what you know.
Surely that's more valuable.
Yeah, well, it's exactly, but it's a kind of a thing that what's really striking actually is that mentoring schemes have changed the culture of UK poetry. They haven't just been about the poets themselves. So I suppose the biggest one in the 21st century is Complete Works. The one set up by Natalie Taylor, essentially in response to this, I think it's a 2004 report, which essentially found that like there were fewer than, or maybe 1% of poetry published in the UK was by Black and minority ethnic
1%?
writers. 1%.
Wow.
Yeah. And actually, in terms of the surveys they did, they found particularly around Black communities that were much higher instances of reading poetry than in other communities. So the kind of sense that community which was very engaged in literature was not represented in mainstream poetry. And so Complete Works was set up, and it worked to kind of mentor up-and-coming poets. And because it worked in successive years, and because also poetry is quite small, as we've been discussing, poetry is quite a small place.
Yeah.
The amazing thing about poetry is, it has some histories of being elitist, but you can change stuff quite quickly because of this scale. Like changing massive organisations is quite hard, but a small community of people, things can change. So within about 10 years, that statistic about 1% of poets being published who were not white was like, instead it was like 14-15%, so it's really changed massively. And then the other intervention, which kind of follows on from that, was the Ledbury Emerging Critics Scheme.
Yeah.
And again, that kind of sense that actually all this great poetry is being published, but if all the people reviewing it are mostly male critics, and in fact there was some hilarious, not hilarious, terrifying, but hilarious statistic from a report that came out, which said that in 1 year there were more more poetry reviews by men called David than there were by writers of colour. So I kind of sense that
there are a lot of people called David.
It's true. But yeah, just a kind of sense that things need to change. So the critics scheme did the same sort of thing really, but for critics. And again, it's massively changed the reviewing culture, and also changed what as you say, like what the culture of writing is. So it's amazing.
Yeah,
really.
I've certainly found that because I'm a book reviews editor for this journal of Yeats studies, and I've had a bit of pushback because I'm always trying to get new people to review, and some people will say, well, what's wrong with the existing people who review?
Yeah.
They're the ones who know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, yes, but they know it within a very small context where everybody agrees with each other and it has all the same experiences.
Yeah.
And it's almost a fear of the new as well,
Yeah.
because it's like, oh, if they come in and they say something different, then this world we've set up around Yeats studies might be threatened
absolutely,
somehow.
Yeah. Taste will change and but in really new and exciting ways. And again, we started this podcast conversation by thinking about people being scared of poetry.
Yeah.
And I think in another part of the poetry world, it's people being scared of change. And actually, once you realise that poetry isn't an ossified, dead thing full of poets from the past that you have to kind of honour, but actually is a living, breathing thing, it's just more exciting. And it doesn't surprise me that those schemes in the last 20 years have created a culture where, when I started teaching, like 15 years ago, poetry was the course that nobody wanted to do. And so you have to begin your first year course by saying, okay, who's interested in poetry? Apologies. Whereas now, it's like, it's the most kind of vital, exciting place.
Really?
Like everything has changed.
I could say that.
And it's changed really because of the really amazing work by people like Natalie Tiegler or Benedict Evaristo to kind of like change the culture.
So could you say just a little bit about how you got into the mentoring project?
Yeah.
Was it kind of accidental, or is it something that you were thinking about for a while?
Well, it sort of started, I think, because I've been working a lot with an organisation called Artful Scribe. And I guess that organisation itself is quite an interesting insight into what universities can and can't do. So it was actually somebody who did the MA in creative writing at Southampton, a long time ago, and finished, and then was in Southampton and thought, right, I want to work as a writer. And they thought, actually, I spent a lot of time looking at poetry. I have absolutely no idea how I'll make a living, what I will do, and how I'll help people, etc., etc. So from that, Matt West set up this organisation, a literary development organisation called Artful Scribe. And it's not one which is aiming to, as it were, offer professional poets a way to take their career to the next level, but rather it's one that is helping at grassroots level everyone get involved in poetry. So it might be through writing for well-being groups, or it might be through school poetry slams, or it might be through open mic nights. And so all this activity was happening, and like many amazing literary organisations, it was just him and some other people. So it was a very small organisation, and it was really hard for them to be able to, I guess, do the forward planning to make other stuff happen sometimes. And because I've been working with Matt for a while, I knew kind of what incredible work the organisation did, and also that they work with loads of communities in the area. And we kind of spoke to them and then to Winchester Poetry Festival and thought, wouldn't it be good if, as well as all this work of kind of open mics, etc., we kind of think about some of those mentoring schemes that have gone on across the UK and think about what would be to do on kind of regionally, right? So we came up with this idea for Poetry Ambassadors. And we worked with 3 mentors, Caleb Parkin, Romulan Anti and Aviva Deutsch, and then had a call out for mentees who were then kind of mentored across a year over Zoom because it was during COVID.
Yeah.
And then they performed their work and had it published at the end of that year. And for an academic who is often reading about things that happened a long time ago in archives and libraries, actually seeing something happen in real time was incredible. And like seeing what happened to their poetry and to their confidence. And these were people who were quite, I think the youngest had just turned 18 when the mentoring started. So younger people making their way in the world, but in a very difficult time where essentially they were housebound. Right, and so just having this thing that was happening to them at the same time was just really, really great to see.
And I talked last series to someone who's working on poetry and care, and she was actually saying how for carers having these groups on Zoom was actually a good thing, because it meant they didn't have to leave their homes and they didn't have to leave their responsibilities. And for people who had social awkwardness, actually sometimes those things that were facilitated by the pandemic were helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a funny way.
And there's a massive accessibility thing, isn't there, about keeping the door open. And so many spaces don't realise they're really inaccessible because all the people in them find it comfortable.
Yeah.
And then getting someone who isn't comfortable there makes you realise, there's a massive worry about just getting through the door of a place like a university or a place where poetry might happen. And actually, if people are happy on Zoom and they can turn their cameras off, suddenly all this stuff is available to them. So
It's all in their control.
It's all in their control. So I think that's been massively helpful for making poetry even more open in terms of its networks.
And I think one of the things that Oxford needs to work on is that idea as well, not just like people getting in or people being here, but people physically going through the doors. I had this really interesting conversation a couple of weeks ago with somebody about the Natural History Museum and the fact that it has a huge wooden door that looks like a castle door. And they were saying that's the most off-putting door I've ever seen. Why don't they have a glass atrium so people know what they're looking into?
Yeah.
And I thought, I've never thought about that. But so many buildings in Oxford are like that. And as you said, if you've already gone through the door, you wouldn't notice that. But it is a big deal for people.
Yeah, and I guess everyone, wherever we are, in whatever context, everyone has spaces probably incredibly near them where they would feel uncomfortable and never go. Yeah. And we obviously police our sense of how we travel around the world. Particularly maybe we live in cities where there's lots of different things all in a small space where we would feel uncomfortable. Yeah. And so often with people who are kind of thinking, how do I get X through the door? A really good starting point is almost thinking, where would I not go? Where do I not feel comfortable? And what is stopping me going there? And everyone has places they feel uncomfortable. So it's worth thinking about. And online can be a really good for a starting point. And also meeting people where they are rather than thinking, this amazing thing is happening, I'm doing it, and why aren't people here? Which is, is kind of harder.
To schmooze and all this.
Yeah, exactly.
I was also thinking as you were talking that I think what's quite subversive about the mentoring scheme and what comes through in your podcast as well is it's something about the transparency of it that acknowledges influence and acknowledges that this isn't some sort of muse overtaking you and then you're just this kind of poet on their own singing of the muses. It's actually a much more kind of complicated but also collaborative thing. And I wonder if that is quite even slightly political in a way, because it kind of goes against this notion, like we talked about earlier, this obscure, difficult, solitary practice. Yeah,
that's really interesting. It kind of makes me think about there's an academic, I think based at Queen Mary, Peter Hayworth, who's written this thing about poetry at festivals.
Oh yeah.
Like pop festivals and, not kind of literature festivals, but kind of festivals where music's happening and poetry's also there. And one of the people he interviewed talked about seeing a poet, Roger Robinson, perform, and they said it was an amazing performance. And what I loved about watching him perform is before he performed, he introduced his work and he kind of said, and I want to shout out all my mentors who've helped me, and explained all the different ways that all these amazing people have taught him how to write poetry. And this person came away and they didn't know much poetry and they'd never kind of really written any before. But they said, I've always thought poetry is something that's written by geniuses on a hill. And I really appreciate somebody saying in a visible way, this has been the result of loads of work. And it's really strange because in other art forms, we might think about a painter being a genius, but we have art schools and we have apprenticeships, and we think about people training for years and years and years. Yeah. And it's really odd that poetry seems unique and it's apparently an art form where it just happens, right? And the muse is there. Yeah. So I do think it's really helpful to think about
in painting as well, there's a really interesting analogy because you've got those you've got those things like Rubens and then all his followers who did the, in the style of Rubens, for example. And that was how art was created for a very long time, wasn't it?
And I think it's really helpful also because of so little infrastructure in this country for poetry, that the people who have made that infrastructure often have a relationship to art. So Mimi Calvati was a painter, and so it was almost like, where's the art school for poetry? And I was like, there isn't one. And she made the poetry school. And then a really early amazing mentor, sort of, in a university context, was George Xerxes, who's mentored lots of people. And it's really striking that he was at the Norwich School of Art, as then was in the 80s. And so lots of people he was mentoring had actually come there for art, but kind of were really familiar with this idea that you don't become amazing at painting by doing anything other than practicing every day and also copying. So as you were saying with the Rubens, something that's a real revolution is that sense that there's such strange ideas about originality in poetry, and a really amazing way, often with students that we might do in a creative writing classroom, is you take an existing poem, and the way you really sit with the structure is you write a new poem exactly with that structure, but kind of change some things around it. And that's how you really learn, how the sentence structures are working, how the sounds, all those kinds of things. So I think poetry has learned and can learn a lot from art about the
even
support.
Someone like T.S. Eliot, who I think is, guilty for a lot of this. Poetry is hard, poetry is difficult, acknowledges, doesn't he, in tradition and the individual talent that mature poets steal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the first, when people kind of, in that first rush of writing poetry, and they might come to you and go, where do I start? And of course, where you want to start is with reading other poets and kind of thinking about how they work. And
but you do get those people who say, I don't read poetry because I don't want it to muddy my verse.
Yeah.
You say, well, how do you know what your writing is? Not just good, but is it poetry? How would you know if you've never read it?
Yeah, and it does seem like from the people I've spoken to for the book that that's the last thing that happens. So for places where I guess the mentoring's been more of a workshop thing, so Malika's Poetry Kitchen is a good example where Malika Booker and Roger Robinson had seen this or experienced this amazing mentoring session by Kwame Dawes and sort of thought, how can we pass on this amazing experience? So they decided to set up their own kind of kitchen workshop really. And actually all the poets who've come through it, they're so different in form, and there's not at all a sense of we have to write it in this way, or it's Malika's Poetry Kitchen, so we write down poetry, but more a sense of, because everyone does their own thing, it's not like there's a hierarchy of this is the Rubens who everyone has to be, and you can do it in all different ways. And I think also poetry is, lots of people who read contemporary poetry are also contemporary poets, but that's a joyful thing to me. It's like a reciprocal thing that you go to poetry readings, you buy poetry books, you read poetry books, you edit, you review, you kind of do all this other work which is connected to your poetry, and it all nourishes it.
I suppose that's quite similar. So Dominic Berry was telling us earlier about how he thinks that poets have a responsibility to the space that they take up. And I guess you could see that as part of the responsibility of being a poet, that you have to be part of this scene. You can't be a poet hiding away, disliking everyone else. I mean, you could if you were as good as someone like Stevie Smith or Marianne Moore, but usually you need to know what's in the ether, right? For you to write your own response.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it does do a disservice to that culture if you don't take part in it.
Yeah, and also writing, even if you are in a really kind of wonderful scene and doing lots of things, and of course some people are naturally more introverted and just that's not their thing. They might kind of be doing it in different sorts of ways, but writing can be really solitary, and it can start with this kind of joyful moment of solitude, but that can really turn into something quite lonely. And it's not a surprise that across the history of poetry there are lots of people writing poems about being very miserable, and of course they might have been miserable and started writing poetry, but also writing in a solitary way can be really, really miserable. So also just in terms of that resilience, if you're a poet, again, you're not going to make a fortune, you're going to get loads and loads of rejections, but knowing that all poets are doing that, and that's absolutely fine, and that you enter these things and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, is also really good to know.
So just as we kind of wind down, I will say, disclaimer, I've been to your house, and I think of you as someone who has a lot of poetry books. You and your husband read a lot of poetry books, so in a way that often intimidates me. I think, my goodness, I need to buy some more poetry.
Oh, you can't have the Professor of Oxford being intimidated by poetry.
How do you read those books? Do you have a kind of place that you go? Do you have a way that you do it? Do you consume a whole book at once? How do you do it?
Well, it's interesting often, or like increasingly, I think it's changed in that now often I'll go to like a festival or hear some poets read, and if a poet really kind of connects or is very powerful, I'll buy their book.
Oh, right, okay.
And often the poem I've heard them read will be the first one I go to, then there'll be these other kinds of connections. And also because of the world we've been talking about, where poets are much more vocal about other poets. You know, even in their introductions, they might say, I've been really inspired by X or Y poet. And so almost every poet comes with a kind of list of other poets you might kind of want to think about. I think Gail McConnell was the last poet. I was thinking about who I heard where I was not familiar with their work before and heard them read, and it was just so powerful. So yeah, that's kind of, I suppose, where I put it.
So the book becomes almost a souvenir of the reading.
Yeah, the time, like a space and time. And I think also since COVID, I felt that particularly because it feels so joyful to be in a room with people.
It does, doesn't it?
There's something about actually what the reading is reminding me of is being in a room with people, which is the opposite to like when I started reading as a kid. It was more like, oh, I want to be away from this very large family. I want to hide in a room with my book and be away from everybody. I've got my poetry, as Simon and Garfunkel saying, you know, I don't need anything else. I'm an island. But yeah, I think it's kind of reversed.
Yeah, fascinating. So as somebody who does read a lot of poetry, is there a poet or a poem or a collection of poems that you would recommend for someone who is new to this whole world? Oh. You've mentioned a lot of poets already today. But...
We'd definitely like to mention Hot Sauce by Casey Hill. So that's one of the poets who was mentored through Poetry Ambassadors. And as is the way sometimes with these things, Aviva Deutsch really helped her in her poetry, not just kind of think about it as a form, but also what might happen next. And so encouraged her to apply for the James Ferrier Poetry Prize, which was like a inaugural prize of kind of basically supporting somebody, giving them more mentoring, and at the end of it, a chance to publish their work. I'm obviously very emotionally invested in like this amazing poet, but I think also having worked in the area of kind of Southampton and around for a long time, it's an area which kind of, in terms of kind of writing, there are actually some amazing writers from Southampton, but notwithstanding like Dickens from Portsmouth and Austen from Southampton, people think that writing's from the past. And so like the sense of, you've got this amazing poet from Andover who's a poet who will be like on a national stage and people will hear that and go, this person's from here, it's great. So I'm going to do a big recommendation for Hot Sauce from Casey Hill.
Feels like regionality is becoming a thing now more in contemporary poetry, is exactly what Dominic was talking about as well.
The kind of place and being the community, and I think that's really an exciting thing, and also means it really opens your eyes to like a new map of the country. So like you travel around and you might go and hear poetry in a particular place, and it will just really tell you about it. And I think, because of so much of culture in the past decades has kind of got, like not that it's also in service stations, but there's a lot which is kind of like seems the same wherever you go. And so exactly, so the sense that wherever you might go in the UK, there'll be some voices which will tell you about the particularity of that place and that time is like really joyful. So I would say actually to somebody wanting to get started, pick up some listings and find some poetry, go to an event and just see what it does for you and go from there.
I think those things are also a really good way of working out why you like certain things and why you don't like others.
Yeah, exactly, because you can also feel loads of people responding. You might be responding with them, you might be thinking, I'm not feeling this in the same way, and it's quite nice.
So you can kind of test out your own.
Or you might find somebody who doesn't like the thing and you don't like it, and then you start chatting and they go, well, I really like this, and that's a really good way to do it. So basically, I think talking to people.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much. It's been a rich and wonderful discussion.
Well, thank you so much. It's been really, really a joy to be here, and carry on demystifying poetry. It's really important work. So thank you.
Thank you. See you next time on Demystifying Poetry. If you've enjoyed the podcast, do consider sharing it with your friends and your neighbours and anyone else you know. And also, you might consider sharing it on social media channels. You can leave a review on Apple Podcasts or you can comment on YouTube or Spotify.